Today's video is titled Wage Suppression During Fiscal Dominance. In layman's terms, why you're poor, anxious, and depressed. Let's dive in. First, we must understand how wages are priced. How is your pay actually being determined? And to understand that, we must understand that this is a job market just like any other market, like the stock market or the housing market. There are both buyers and there are sellers. In this case, in the job market, the workers are the sellers. They are selling their time and productivity, and employers are the buyers. They are willing to pay a wage to the seller, to the worker, for that time and productivity. Now, traditional markets are highly liquid, allowing buyers and sellers to agree on a price, and the seller can sell their asset at a price they believe is fair, and the buyer can buy the asset from the seller at a price that they believe is fair. However, job markets behave as if there is a skew in this liquidity in which the buyers or the employers have high liquidity while the sellers or the workers have very low liquidity. In other words, the buyers or employers have lots of people to buy from, while the sellers have a limited number of people to sell to and more friction. And this causes the buyers or the employers to control the trade price, paying the lowest amount that the least advantaged worker within a skill set would be willing to sell their time and productivity for. Now, to conceptualize this, if you're an options trader, let's think of that. If not, just stick with me, it'll all make sense. But if you are an options trader, let's say you are selling a covered call. When you sell a covered call, there is a buyer. The buyer wants to pay as little as possible for that option. So they want to set the price really, really low. That is going to be the bid price. And then there's also the seller. The seller wants to get as much premium as possible and wants to sell that option for as high of a price as possible, creating the ask price. Now, with the job market, it's very similar. There's the employees having the bid price pretty low, and then the workers who have an ask price that is pretty high. Now, if you don't do options, don't worry, just stick with me. All you need to know is that employees want to pay a low price while the workers want to get paid a high price. So right over here, I've got the wage here. So as we go up, that's a higher wage. So we have employers down here who are, as we mentioned before, they are the buyers. They want to buy the time and the productivity of the sellers, of the workers. But there is a skew in liquidity. There's only a few employers or a few buyers in this market, and there are a whole bunch of workers looking to sell their time and productivity for a wage. And we get this skew in liquidity where there are a whole lot of sellers and very few buyers down here. On top of that, the sell orders or the workers have more frictions. So each of these sell orders up here represents a person and the wage that they are willing to sell their time and productivity for. Now, let's say one of these sell orders, this guy right over here, say his wife just got into a medical emergency and he is running out of money. He needs money fast and right now. He cannot wait for one of these buy orders, one of these employees to come up in pricing because he needs money fast. So he is going to be more likely to lower that price and get that price filled because every buy order requires a sell order and every sell order requires a buy order to get filled. And because of the skew in liquidity and the frictions within the working class, it is going to be far easier for the orders to get filled down here than it is for these orders to come up and meet the wages that the workers desire. So over time, let's say one other worker or one other seller has a friction where they just got into a car accident. They need cash quickly, so they may be willing to go down and get a job, even though that job is giving them a lower price than they would originally desire, but they really need money right now, so they're willing to go down and meet that pricing. And then another person, say this person is about to get evicted and needs cash really quickly to keep their house to or keep their apartment and not avoid being evicted. So they may be willing to go down and fill this order down here. So over time, because of this skew in liquidity and these frictions within the working class, the the wages end up falling down to the bid price or to the employer's pricing down here rather than what the employees, the workers, would ask for up here. And that forces anyone that has not filled their order, that does not have a job yet, to have to come down here in order to at some point fill their job. So wages end up falling down to this quote unquote bid price. And what does that wage actually represent? What does that price actually represent? Well, I wrote this down because it's very important. It represents the lowest amount that the least advantaged workers within a skill set would be willing to sell their time and productivity for. Now, this in and of itself is not super problematic, but it becomes extremely problematic when we're in fiscal dominance and have to perpetually expand credit. When a government is in fiscal dominance, their monetary policy must revolve around financing their debt. Now, they can do this by lowering interest rates, which artificially increases borrowing and lending power, giving people access to more debt. They can also inject liquidity into banks to stimulate demand for their debt, to stimulate demand for treasuries, which gives banks more lending power, thus also expanding credit and giving people access to more and more debt over time. Regardless, when a government is in fiscal dominance, it results in perpetual credit expansion where people get more and more access to debt over time, which is a huge problem for the working class. Because remember, the price of wages is determined by the lowest price at which the least advantaged workers within a skill set are willing to sell their time and productivity for. And with this, in fiscal dominance, with credit expansion, when interest rates are lowered and liquidity is pumped into the system, it creates inflationary pressure, which increases cost of living. And you would think that wages would rise with that cost of living so that the workers can meet their lifestyle. But if wages are determined based on the least advantaged workers, then those least advantaged workers would be more likely to be willing to take on debt to meet their lifestyle and to meet their needs. So if they're willing to take on debt, it perpetually suppresses the wages relative to inflation. So as long as we're in fiscal dominance and credit continuously expands and access to debt continuously expands, inflation will always be outrunning the growth of wages. Now, going back to my drawings, remember that we have the employers or the buyers who are pricing in wages down here, and then we have the workers who are pricing in wages up here. And because of the skew in liquidity and the friction within the working class right up here, the price ends up favoring the employers or the buyers down here, and this price represents the lowest amount that the least advantaged workers within a skill set would be willing to sell their time and skills for. Now, as inflation comes up, the cost of living goes up, which will be represented by this line right over here. So as the cost of living goes up, the workers want their wages to go up at least in proportion to that inflation to offset that increase in cost of living. However, because there is a skew in liquidity favoring the lower pricing, the buyer's pricing, that is represented by the lowest amount that the least advantaged workers are willing to sell their time and skills for, as long as there are a few workers that are desperate enough to take on debt. Plus, they have the friction of time where they can't go very long without a job to be able to sustain their lifestyle that they need to. So, what's going to actually happen to those people in a desperate situation, rather than demanding that wages rise equivalently with inflation or exceed inflation. They will be okay with wages underperforming inflation as long as their access to debt increases enough to cover that difference. So this line right over here represents the increased access to debt, and this line over here represents the wage growth, which ends up being that actual wage growth, which will always be underperforming the actual rate of inflation. So people are always going to be getting poorer and poorer over time. In summary, when a government is in fiscal dominance in which their monetary policy must revolve around financing their debt, it's going to lead to expandable credit by either suppressing interest rates or injecting liquidity or a combination of both, which will increase the system's lending capacity, allowing people to borrow more money. With that expandable credit, as cost of living goes up, rather than being reliant on proportionately increasing wages, a subset of workers within each tier or within each skill set will utilize the expanding credit to help fund their lifestyle through an increased use of debt. And since liquidity is skewed in the buyer or the employer's favor, the price of wages gets set not by the workers as a collective group, but by the subset of workers who lower their standards of living and utilize the increased access of debt to help maintain their lifestyle, which ensures that wages are perpetually suppressed relative to inflation as cost of living increases, making the working class poorer and poorer over time. Now, this is problematic because it ensures that the working class has to reduce their quality of life over time, or they have to utilize debt to be able to continue funding their lifestyle, in which case, do they really own anything to begin with at that point? So, in fiscal dominance, wealth must be redistributed. It can be redistributed through those wage suppression mechanisms that I've mentioned, where wealth transfers away from the working class and towards the creditors and the asset holders, where that liquidity is being absorbed into. As this unfolds, the working class will increasingly lean towards socialist policies, which would advocate for the forced confiscation, aka increased taxation, and redistribution of wealth. And this would be packaged as a redistribution of wealth away from the wealthy and towards the poor and towards the working class. Now, the problem with this is that socialist policies do not fight the root causes of problems, they fight the outcomes of problems, which ironically makes this problem even worse for the working class themselves. For example, let's say a government says they are going to increase taxation to fund a free housing program. Well, what did we learn about wage growth? Wage prices are determined by the lowest price that the least advantaged workers within a skill set are willing to sell their time and productivity for. Now, if those least advantaged workers become dependent on free housing, what's that going to do with wage growth as cost of living goes up? As cost of living goes up, wages would naturally want to go up relatively in line with that increased cost of living. But what happens with that when that subset of the least advantaged group of workers, when they get free housing, their cost of living, it doesn't have to go up. Wages don't have to go up in line with cost of living because now they have free housing. So then wages stay suppressed. And those suppressed wages affect everybody within that same group or within that same skill set, as if none of them have to pay for housing, so that it eventually gets to the point where everybody within that skill set gets poorer and poorer until they fall to the point where they qualify for that free housing program. So then over time, it just creates a system where everybody becomes dependent on debt and the government, and nobody can afford anything for themselves. And the real issue is that there is no fix within our current monetary system, because our current monetary system relies on constant deficits. If the US is the world reserve currency, it brings up the Triffin's dilemma, where the US, the global economy, is reliant on the US providing US dollars. So the US has to export a whole bunch of dollars. They have to spend more dollars than they receive for the global economy to work. So within our current monetary system, the US must constantly run deficits, which means the US must always be in fiscal dominance, which means there will always be credit expansion and increased access to debt over time, allowing these wage suppression mechanics to begin in the first place. Now, the solution is to make money a free market because that's where the issue arose from. Because money itself is not a free market when the government can adjust interest rates and can print money and inject liquidity into the system, altering the value of the currency itself, allowing for expandable credit, which created this whole issue in the beginning. Now, some may say that things like gold could be used to create a free market of money. I strongly disagree because gold has already failed us because it doesn't meet all of the necessary monetary properties. For example, gold is not very divisible and it's not very transportable, which led to the centralization of gold itself, in which centralized banks and vaults control most of the supply of gold. So it's hard for people outside of those areas to verify the actual supply of gold. And on top of that, it allows centralized banks to issue paper claims to gold in which they could issue more claims to gold than they actually have. However, we do have an alternate monetary system, Bitcoin, which meets all monetary properties and is decentralized. And because it already meets all monetary properties, it won't become centralized like gold was because gold failed to meet all of the monetary properties. Bitcoin also has a known and predictable supply and is verifiable by anybody, creating a free market of money that is deflationary in nature, which prevents hidden credit expansion and removes manipulation of supply and demand. Over time, I believe Bitcoin will replace our current monetary system because Bitcoin outcompetes all other monetary systems and has established protocol dominance, which would make it very difficult to ever be replaced by anything new. On top of that, Bitcoin also works. It can actually fix the issues that have been created by our current monetary system. I believe that either Bitcoin wins or society itself collapses and everyone becomes controlled within society. My name is Ian Gillespie. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing to support my work.